All right, let's dive right into this explainer and completely demystify exactly how criminal actions are instituted and controlled under Rule 110 of the Rules of Criminal Procedure. Honestly, if you're a first-year law student, this is your absolute bread and butter. We're going to map out the procedural funnel that takes an accusation from just a mere piece of paper to a full-blown criminal trial. And to really anchor our understanding in reality, we'll be dissecting a landmark Supreme Court case, Heirs of Delgado versus Gonzalez. So we have a packed roadmap today. We are going to cover institution under Rule 110, the specific case facts of Delgado v. Gonzalez, the main legal issue, the ruling and ratio decidendi, the overarching doctrine of prosecutor control, and finally, we'll wrap up with some crucial bar and recitation tips.
First up, institution under Rule 110, starting the engine.
Now, you might be wondering, what is the central question of Rule 1110, Section 1? Well, it's this. How does the state actually legally commence a criminal proceeding against an accused? Because, it doesn't just spontaneously happen in a courtroom. There is a highly specific, mandated process that absolutely must be followed depending on the severity of the offense. And right away, we have to draw a really strict boundary with our legal terminology. A complaint and an information are definitely not interchangeable words in criminal procedure. It's a classic rookie mistake. A complaint is the written accusation that actually initiates the whole process. When a preliminary investigation is required, you file this complaint with the proper investigating officer, not the judge. An information, on the other hand, is the formal criminal accusation filed directly in court by the prosecutor, but only after they've found enough evidence during their own investigation. So the crucial takeaway here is that for the heavier offenses, specifically those meeting that classic codal threshold of at least 4 years, 2 months, and 1 day, the process literally has to commence with a preliminary investigation. The practical first step? Filing a complaint affidavit with the proper officer, like a city or provincial prosecutor. The exact moment that complaint is properly filed with them, boom, that marks the legal institution and commencement of the criminal proceeding. Okay, moving on to part 2, the case facts, Delgado versus Gonzalez, which is really a massive battle for control. Let's look at how this timeline played out, because it's a wild procedural ride. First, Federico Delgado was found dead and Annalisa Pesico was injured. Naturally, the police filed murder and frustrated murder charges. But look at step 2. The investigating prosecutor evaluates the evidence and actually recommends dismissal. Then the Secretary of Justice steps in, reverses this, and orders an information to be filed. But wait, it doesn't stop there. The Court of Appeals then jumps in and nullifies the Secretary of Justice's resolution. This procedural ping-pong leads us directly to the climax at step 5. The heirs of Delgado desperately wanted this criminal case to proceed, so they petitioned the Supreme Court to revive it. But, and this is the kicker, they did this entirely on their own, completely without the Office of the Solicitor General or the OSG. Which brings us to the main legal issue, standing in criminal appeals. In classic law school fashion, we gotta phrase this as a whether or not question. Whether or not a private family can independently force a criminal prosecution to continue when the government's own lawyers, the OSG, choose not to file an appeal. Basically, does a victim's family actually own the criminal case? Let's look at the ruling and ratio decidendi, the Supreme Court's definitive answer. And that answer was a resounding, absolute no. The heirs entirely lacked the legal standing to revive or continue the criminal appeal on their own. No OSG, no case. And this slide right here perfectly explains the ratio decidendi, or the reasoning behind that strict ruling. The court pointed out that every single crime essentially creates 2 distinct tracks of liability, criminal and civil. Now, while the private offended party, or in this case, their heirs, have an absolute interest in the civil aspect, damages, restitution, private injury, the criminal aspect is an offense against public order. Therefore, the criminal aspect is exclusively owned by the state. Because the crime is ultimately an offense against the state, criminal actions are filed in the name of the people of the Philippines. The state is the real party in interest here. And at the appellate level, like before the Court of Appeals or the Supreme Court, the Office of the Solicitor General is the absolute and sole appellate counsel of the people. Actually, since the OSG did not appeal the dismissal in this specific case, the private heirs simply had zero legal power to do it for them. Let's unpack this further in Section 5, Doctrine and Prosecutor Control, the power of the state. Under Rule 110, Section 5, all criminal actions, whether commenced by complaints or by information, shall be prosecuted under the direction and control of the prosecutor. It is the Department of Justice that is explicitly authorized to prosecute criminal cases on behalf of the people. This makes the private complainant's interest in the actual criminal prosecution totally subordinate to the state's public prosecutor. They are entirely in the driver's seat. And remember, a preliminary investigation is definitely not a trial. It is a strict pre-filing prosecutorial screening. The state delegates immense power to the prosecutor to decide if court resources should even be utilized in the first place. During this phase, the prosecutor is just evaluating the complaint and counter affidavits. Again, no full trial. They then issue a resolution. And note this standard because it is heavily tested. Under the modern DOJ framework, prosecutors are looking for prima facie evidence with reasonable certainty of conviction. This is an internal prosecutorial standard specifically designed to prevent weak cases from clogging up the courts, and it is highly distinct from the standard a judge later uses to determine judicial probable cause for an arrest warrant. The prosecutor just exercises fast, almost unparalleled discretion here. All right, part 6, the good stuff. Bar and recitation tips for acing the details. Pay close attention to these exam traps because professors love them. A professor might ask you, can the victim's family ever appeal after a criminal case is dismissed? The trick is that students almost always just blurt out no. But the correct answer is they can appeal, but, and it's a huge but, their appeal is strictly limited to the civil aspect of the case. They absolutely cannot appeal the criminal dismissal itself. Second trap, private lawyers cannot argue the criminal appeal. The OSG is the sole counsel for the state. Your memory aid for this doctrine is super simple. Delgado means the criminal appeal belongs to the state and the OSG. So, to summarize our key takeaway today, what makes a criminal action properly instituted under Rule 110? Well, it is legally commenced by filing the proper complaint with the investigating prosecutor. And from that exact moment on, the state, representing the people of the Philippines, holds the absolute keys to the criminal track. They retain uncompromising direction and control over the prosecution from the very first preliminary investigation all the way up to the Supreme Court. The private party's role? Relegated entirely to civil liability. But this does leave us with a really critical, provocative question to ponder. If the state holds absolute, uncompromising control over this criminal track, what recourse does a victim really have if a prosecutor acts in bad faith and just refuses to file charges? Until next time, keep exploring the limits of the law.